All right, staying now with this year's race for governor. The four Republicans running in their primary for governor will face off in their own debate on Monday. That's on CBS New York. The four candidates in that race are Congressman Lee Zeldin, the party's favorite, businessman Harry Wilson, former Westchester County Executive Rob Astorino, and Andrew Giuliani. Now, Giuliani has a unique history in New York. You probably know his father, Rudy Giuliani, who was mayor of New York City for 2 terms. Fast forward to 5 years ago, and the younger Giuliani made it to the White House, working under former President Donald Trump. And now he wants to be the next governor of New York. We spoke this week about his campaign and where he stands on top issues ahead of this month's primary. Andrew, thank you so much for coming back. I appreciate it.
Dan, thank you as always for having me.
Of course. So it's been a few months. I want to gauge where you are with voters. You've been on the campaign trail crisscrossing the state. So tell me what you're hearing from voters while you're out there talking to them.
Well, I got to tell you, with nearly 2 weeks until election day, election primary day, and now with an upcoming debate here within the next 48 hours, I'm really excited with where we stand. Obviously, every single independent poll that one of my competitors has not paid for either has us winning this race or within the margin of error. I mean, you can look at the most recent Zogby poll that had us up 6, and when you add the leaners, up 10. I think, Dan, frankly, that's a product of making sure that we got out there and spoke to as many of the 2.9 million registered Republicans as possible. This started over a year ago, as you know, Dan, and to me, it's been so important not just to go to the traditional GOP breakfast, but to make sure we were going to mass gathering places where New Yorkers were. And I think that's why we're seeing this consistent lead in the polls. But again, I'm telling our team, it's all about how, one, we perform at the debates and making sure we get out the vote. So that's the focus of the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think the debates are going to be critical for you. I mean, you already have the advantage of name recognition with the Giuliani name per se, but you have the chance in these next couple of days to get your name out there even more through these debates, maybe match your name to the person. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. And I'm sure some top issues are going to come up during the debates. One of them is guns after the shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde. I want to ask you about the recently passed package of new gun laws in New York. Is there anything in that package that you could support?
You know, right now it's tough to say that I could, to be perfectly honest, Dan. I mean, I look at what I've seen in terms of the red flag laws that were on the books before, and they failed when it came to the Buffalo shooter in terms of Broome County. And I think that's a direct link to the fact that our law enforcement did not have the resources necessary in order to make sure that this madman did not actually get a weapon. For me, what I've done from a crime perspective is propose right now a 6-point plan that will absolutely make sure that we make New York a safer place. Going after the illegal weapons and making sure that they're out of the hands of those that actually are committing these heinous crimes, I think is so important. But I don't think it's necessarily going after Second Amendment rights. I would also look at a full repeal of bail reform on day one, and I'd also keep DAs accountable, like Alvin Bragg. We just saw this last week. The DA in San Francisco get recalled. While we don't have recall here in New York, I would utilize Article 8, Section 13B of the New York State Constitution to remove Alvin Bragg and to put him on trial on day one of my administration. I think that's going to help all New Yorkers when we keep DAs accountable and make sure they're executing the oath of office.
It's a tricky issue, this gun issue, and the awful tragedies in Buffalo and Uvalde, because it's not necessarily a crime issue as much as it is partly a mental health issue, partly, some say, access to guns, partly, you know, the Buffalo shooter was influenced by white supremacy, for example. You said that police didn't have the resources to maybe prevent that. So can you walk me through what the law enforcement may have needed that may have prevented this attack in Buffalo?
Well, I think first and foremost, we know that nearly a year ago, in June of last year, we actually had information that this guy was planning on shooting up his school. I mean, he had said that. And instead, New York State Police detained him for about 24 hours and then released him and let him go. On top of that, the red flag laws that were signed, did not immediately spark him. I think we can all agree, whatever side of the aisle on, that anybody who threatens to shoot up their school should not have access to a weapon. So the fact that our law enforcement did not actually have the resources necessary to make sure that the red flag laws that were on the books did not prevent this madman from getting a weapon shows that there was certainly something that was missed in all this. To me, I think that's a direct connection between what we've seen in terms of a lot of the, and I'll call it, in some areas, it is truly some of the defunding of our police. But in some ways, it's reimagining our police. In some ways, it's just a matter of making it tougher and tougher for our law enforcement to have the resources that they need necessary to have the level of force that we actually need to prevent things like that. And that goes all the way back, I would even say, to 2009, when our tier benefits changed from a tier 2 to a tier 5 and tier 6 benefits, which has made it that much tougher to actually get the talent of law enforcement here in the state of New York and keep the talent of law enforcement here in New York. To me, I look at it this way. I think really the nucleus of making sure that New York is safer is making sure that we give law enforcement the resources necessary, Dan, so that way we can prevent not just shooting attacks like this, but also inner city violence that we've seen that has run rampant in our state over the last 3 years since bail reform was signed into law. I think it's unacceptable when you look at the fact that Rochester and Binghamton last year had the most murders ever in recorded history, and Rochester right now is on pace to surpass that. That's unacceptable.
I don't want to mischaracterize your position. So we're talking about the red flag gun laws. So do you support those gun laws as a way to prevent these tragedies? And do you support the concept of, in these instances where somebody makes a threat to somebody, to themselves, or may harm themselves, would you support police using those red flag laws to remove their guns in those incidents?
I absolutely support making sure that somebody who has mental health issues like this guy, somebody who's crazy, somebody who's a madman, cannot get access to a weapon. I think we had the information there. And like I said, I question the resources that state law enforcement have. I question then Governor Cuomo and now Governor Hochul in terms of what they knew and the knowledge of all this. But I would also look at the FBI. And why wasn't the FBI actually aware of this in particular? I know the FBI has been focused on the Donald Trumps and the Rudy Giulianis and also parents in identifying them potentially as domestic terrorists, Dan. I think really the FBI's resources should be focused on making sure that somebody like this does not actually get the weapon that they need.
So let's turn to another top issue in New York and across the country right now. The Supreme Court is considering an overturn of Roe v. Wade. I actually don't know your position on abortion. So can you lay out where you are on that, pro-life versus pro-choice?
I am pro-life. Look, I think about my daughter every time I think about this. And I remember the first time that I saw her on the ultrasound, Dan. And to me, it was obvious as a parent, as a father. The most important thing I knew at that moment when I saw her there at a couple weeks old was protecting her life. So for me, I am pro-life, and obviously in looking at what could come out of the Supreme Court, I will say, and one of the things I think we don't focus on this is the fact that this Supreme Court leak, I think, was egregious. And the link with probably kind of more liberal media. And I think you get a very, very different response when it comes to issues that would look to benefit Democrats, if you will, in an election than maybe those that would benefit conservatives.
You know, on that note, speaking of Democrats, if you are elected as governor, there's a chance that you may be working with Democrats in the state legislature. They may keep the majority rather in the Assembly and the Senate. Tell me how your governing style would be there. How could you work to reach across the aisle to get things done in Albany with this party?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, in looking at kind of the new maps and where we are now after a very long process, obviously, in getting to where we are, first off, I think the supermajority in the Assembly will cease to exist by the end of the year. And I think I think the supermajority also in the Senate will come to an end for Democrats. And I'm hopeful that Republicans have an outside chance at winning the state Senate. I certainly think with the Giuliani at the top of the ticket, we certainly have a great chance to pick up as many seats in both the Assembly and the state Senate. Look, I have said on day one, I will sit down with Andrea Stewart-Cousins and Carl Heastie, or whoever the Assembly Speaker and the leader of the state Senate is on the time, and I'll lay out my top priorities. I'll have that conversation with them so that way we can have progress for all New Yorkers. But I can tell you one place in particular where I am not willing to compromise, and that is a repeal of bail reform. I think this has been something, Dan, that, look, all politicians have narratives, myself included. When we look at bail reform, we can say that this is an unmitigated disaster, not because I say it is, but because the data backs it up. When we see crime since April of 2019, and since this was signed into law by Cuomo. And since really, I know Kathy Hochul has made a couple of small tweaks, but frankly, she didn't mention it in her State of the State speech, which shows that it's not a priority. And she still does not want to consider dangerousness, as we saw in this previous debate, for judges, what I think is so important in making sure that we don't see issues like we saw in the New York City subway shooter, where you had somebody who was arrested 19 times. To me, that's something that I would say to Stuart Cousins on Carl Hastie, that this is something that we need a full repeal of. And once we have a full repeal, if you want to go back and talk about a few misdemeanors, I'm happy to have that conversation then. But it's a place that right off the bat, I'm not willing to compromise. If we do that, then certainly we could talk about other issues.
Last question for you, and maybe the most important to a lot of New Yorkers. As you and I both know, prices of really everything have been on the rise in the past year, from gasoline to things at the grocery store. If you were governor, what would you do to help New Yorkers through this really tough time? The state has implemented a partial cut to the state's gas tax, but it doesn't seem to be really helping people at the pump all that much. And obviously there's the other costs too.
Yeah, well, Dan, whether you're in Erie County, in Manhattan, or in Hamilton County, you have New Yorkers all across the state that are looking up to this coming winter and asking themselves, am I going to have to choose between heating my home and maybe buying groceries? That to me is unconscionable. Look, I look at the Marcellus Shale and what we have in New York that covers literally 2/3 of our landmass. And that's energy power that I look forward to unleashing as governor, certainly working toward that goal. I think we can point right to, and this is obviously federal, but I think we can point right to the fact that in early 2021, when President Biden took office, he shut down production of the Keystone Pipeline while approving Nord Stream 2. And we can lay gas prices at $2 a gallon, $2 plus a gallon, to now in some places in the state, $5 a gallon. And who knows by the time we get to Election Day. I think America needs to be energy independent. I think looking at the advances in technology in where we are from a clean fracking standpoint and natural gas standpoint, we can do that now. Look, I want to be very clear. I'm not against the idea of renewables and making sure that we can use renewables in the state of New York. I just need to see how it's feasible before we shut off the idea of natural gas. If it's feasible, then I'm willing to have that conversation. Right now, I've seen it feasible in very small doses, and that's why I think it's so important that we make, and I'll say this, New York the best fracking state in the country.
All right, Andrew Giuliani, Republican candidate for governor, thank you as always for being here. I appreciate it.
Dan, always a pleasure joining you. Look forward to coming on again soon.